Before we get officially started, I'd like to, on behalf of the Royal City Literary Arts Society, mention and recognize the Kikite First Nations and all Coast Salish peoples on whose unceded territory we live, learn, and work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Toews. Yes, that's what we agreed. We had a conversation before everybody got here about whether it should be Toews or Taves. And so I think Richard would have been happy with either pronunciations, Toews or Taves. Richard Toews is the author of The Confession and The Quiet in the Land, two novels exploring the Mennonite world within a larger world of Russia in a time of crisis, World War II and the Russian Revolution. Toews spent his academic years teaching at Simon Fraser University, First Nations Institute in Kamloops. During his time at SFU, Toews focused on his research on the nature of justice as a defensive wall against totalitarianism, an important, I think, issue today. Both of his novels are the result of his academic life. In addition to writing novels, Toews has written, produced, and directed a short film, The Prodigal, winner of a Golden Remy at the Houston International Film Festival. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Richard. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you. I want to extend a real note of thanks to the Royal City Literary Arts Society for hosting this and allowing me to present my novel. It's truly an honor. So, as already noted, I'm Richard Taews. I'm about to read to you from my novel, The Confession. As advertised, The Confession is a fictional account of the role some Mennonites played in the Ukrainian Holocaust of 1941. Now, let me reiterate, the novel deals with the participation of some Mennonites with the Nazis in exterminating Jews. More importantly, not all Mennonites were culpable, but that some did, however, is noteworthy enough to raise some interest for me. And a little context, a bit of a backstory may be in order here. To begin, I am a first-generation Mennonite, the son of two Mennonite refugees from Russia, particularly from Ukraine. To fully grasp the significance of my novel, its subject, it is necessary to provide some historical background. It is impossible, however, to provide an in-depth history of the Russian Mennonites in a few minutes. The Russian Mennonites deserve better, but let me have a go at it. So in 1763, Catherine the Great extended an invitation to all Europeans to settle in various parts of Russia. For a variety of reasons, Germans responded in large numbers. German Catholics, German Lutherans, as did the Mennonites from the Vistula region, which back then in the late 18th century was East Prussia, which is today Poland. Now, when growing up, I was told that Catherine was particularly interested in having Mennonites immigrate. Catherine was interested in developing Russia's agriculture, and the Mennonites were famous for the agricultural acumen. In 1789, many of the Mennonites from Prussia emigrated to Russia to set up colonies in the region of Ukraine. The Mennonites of this immigration into Russia left Europe because of religious persecution from Catholics. Catherine assured the Mennonites that they would be granted total religious freedom to use their language, and more importantly, Mennonites were released from all military service. Now, the Mennonites were assured freedom to be conscientious objectors to any and all forms of military service to protect their interests. Now, Mennonites have, from their very beginning, they were noted to be a particular part of their character was a devotion to the sense of non-resistance in all forms, to turn the other cheek. This was for the Mennonites the living out the precepts of the Gospels, the image of Christ, basically. So how is it, given that their commitment to non-resistance, how is it that in 1941, some Mennonites in the Ukraine were willing to join in complicity with the Nazis to exterminate the Jews? My novel tries to provide a picture of that. Now, going back, after their arrival in the Ukraine, the Mennonites experienced for more than 100 years unparalleled prosperity and some degree of peace. Their expertise in matters of agriculture made it possible for Ukraine to become the breadbasket of Europe, and the Mennonites became unbelievably wealthy. As already noted, the Mennonites experienced more than 100 years of peace, and then came World War I. The German-speaking Mennonites in Ukraine welcomed the German army into Russia and provided them with necessary aid and comfort. After the war, and then after the revolution, the Bolsheviks, who paid particular attention to what the Mennonites did in World War I, catastrophically altered the Mennonite social reality. Mennonites were now the target for extermination. They were accused of being German spies. Stalin in particular had a special interest in, he had a special interest in the Mennonites. They were wealthy and they had supported Germany. Their wealth and allegiance provided Stalin with a context. In doing research for my novel, I came across a quote by Stalin, who allegedly said that he wanted to do to the Mennonites what Hitler did to the Jews in Germany. So his strategy was, first of all, to Kulikize the Mennonites. And now that's a long discussion. Basically, it would, they forced the Mennonites onto these collective farms, and if the Mennonites refused, they would be Kulikized, and to be Kulikized was essentially a sentence of death. The Mennonites were arrested with no trial. They were sent to the Gulag or summarily executed on the spot without a trial. Or they were disenfranchised, which simply meant that they had no standing or no status at all in Russia. They were denied all rights and privileges that were afforded to Russian citizens. They couldn't go to school, or they couldn't send their children to school. They were essentially deemed non-existent. And then came the Holodomor, the manufactured famine, which literally killed millions of Russians. Stalin so eloquently pointed out that the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. The number of Stalin's deaths have never been fully calculated, and thereby giving credence to this grotesque remark. And the long and the short of it is because of the Mennonites, because of who the Mennonites were, thousands and thousands perished. But that's not all. That's not the end of the story. Then came 1941, Operation Barbarossa, when the German High Command sent Operation Barbarossa into action, invading Russia. The Mennonites regarded the German army and some of the Nazis as liberators. Now, I want to share the story of two individuals that I met in trying to complete doing the research for my novel. I'll call them Margaret and Peter. They were both in their 90s. Margaret, a very feisty lady, full of life. She tells me the story of her sister, her older sister. She's in the street. It's getting dark in their village. It's getting dark. And out of the dusk comes this tall, stately man dressed in a uniform, well pressed, perfectly coiffed, just, echt Deutsch, if you understand German is. And he asks her, do you speak German? And she said, yes. And he says, well, do you know such and such a man? And she said, yeah, that's my father. And he said, could you introduce him to me, please? And so she goes to the house, to the door, and opens the door, and mother comes out, and she said, introduces her mother to this man. Turns out this man was Himmler, Heinrich Himmler. And they invite him in for dinner. Margaret sits right across it, at the corner of the table across from him. And Himmler asks the father, he said, I understand you survived Stalin's labor camps or labor prison for 8 years. And the man said, yes. And Himmler then says, tell me all about it. Now, this is 1941. That's an important date in the context of this story, because in 1942, Himmler goes back to Germany, and he basically engineers what became the concentration camps and the death camps. So what's Himmler doing? Walking through villages, asking Mennonites about their experience in labor camps. And we do know that the concentration camps were patterned after Stalin's his labor prisons. So then Himmler says to the man, what is one thing I can do for you? And he says, the father says, my daughter, we're Mennonites, so my daughter can't get an education. And she desperately wants to be a teacher, and she needs an education. And Himmler said, done. The next day she was on a train, to Berlin, where Himmler paid for her entire education. Peter is the other person. Peter was a little more, I'm not sure how to describe Peter. Peter was also in his 90s, and he was 15 when he met Himmler. And his aunt, as it turned out, became Himmler's secretary while they were in Russia during this operation. Himmler comes to Peter and he says, what's your name? And Peter says, my name's Peter. And Himmler goes, tussles his hair. I love that name, Peter. Nevertheless, Peter was conscripted into the German army, but it's what Peter said to me that really caught my attention. Peter said to me in describing Himmler, said, we love that man so much. We would have done anything for him. I said, anything? He said, yes, anything. And then he said, and his next remark was the one that caught me completely by surprise and silenced me. He said, if it wasn't for Hitler, I would be dead. It took several minutes for me to respond. And I said, yeah, and if it was, that's true. That may be true, but had Hitler never existed, we wouldn't be, the issue of the Holocaust would not be before us. And he said, I live with that guilt every day. Now we know this, that in communications, Hitler instructed Himmler to pay a special attention to the Mennonites in Ukraine because they were Germans. Himmler wanted to bring all the German-speaking people out of Russia and settle back and bring them back to Germany. But he said, pay particular attention to the Mennonites because the Mennonites were the true Aryans. Now let me read from my novel. Cornelius's earliest memories were of a time when Ukraine was a gentle place of soft summer days and winds. Nettie Friesen, barefoot, led her cows to pasture, and men returned home for the evening meal. Later, hymns were sung around the supper table to the sound of guitars. Boys too young to mow the fields played in the Tukmak River. Girls learned how to be good Mennonites' wives. It was an innocent time for the Mennonites, a prosperous time. They had made Russia rich with the price of their grain. The people were fed and sated. Yes, there were stories of peasant unrest with their Mennonite masters, stories of some Mennonite farmers and factory owners treating the peasants as nothing more than objects for use, sometimes too cruel to talk about, but these were just stories, or so it was said. For the most part, Ukraine had blessed the Mennonites. They lived in peace, living out their faith. Under Catherine, they were known as the quiet in the land, a people in the world, but not of it. They were the silent ones, the separate ones. But now, with the war and revolution over, and with Russia lying in ruins, Germany in defeat, and Stalin in his place, that glorious time was over. The herds were lowing as they crowded at the village gate, raising a cloud of bronze dust in the evening sun setting over the hills and expansive grasslands. Cornelius went out to the fields to bring his cattle home. A pale bluish shadow spread over the land. Above the darkening village of Niederhauptstadt, faint stars began to kindle. The sounds of the village gradually died away. Only a few villagers gathered on the earth embankments of their houses. The night was fresh and still. Cornelius was pleasantly held captive by his memories and images of the past. The full silvery moon sailed out from behind the dark poplars that grew along one side of the village square. In the windows of the houses, lights were burning. The air was laden with the smell of the evening dew and a medley of voices and laughter. By the fences and the houses, white kerchiefs gleamed in the darkness. Mr. Warkentine made an appearance. He was an old warrior with old stories. He was one of the rare survivors of the great leavening of 1917. He was an enormous man with a sturdy build, whose red-brown face, with its bushy snow-white beard, was furrowed by heavy lines and wrinkles. His legs, arms, and shoulders displayed the fine muscular development of a younger man. There were deep scars on his head. Under the short-cropped hair, his thick, sinewy neck was checkered with crisscross folds. Like the neck of a bull, his horny hands were bruised and scratched. How many Bolsheviks met their fate after meeting Mr. Warkentine? Cornelius wondered. Seeing Mr. Warkentine triggered within Cornelius a different memory of a time in between, a time made fulgent by death, and yet in that space of death, there were moments in which we were touched by grace that only comes when the light pierces the night. For the briefest of time, there was the appearance of peace sandwiched between two unimaginable epochs of famine. Death's shadow covered us as if under Athon's outstretched wings, come to feed on Prometheus's liver. It was Dante's Inferno made real, and it had come to visit us. Old women sitting half conscious on the ground, dazed by their hunger, their misery, and their misfortune. Pallid young mothers seeking to feed their dying babies from their milkless breasts. To think of the possibility of hope, the possibility of grace, of light breaking into the darkness of hell might appear to some readers as obscene, and yet it is for moments of hope that grace does indeed forestall the occasion of suicide. For Cornelius, it was the spark of seeing Mr. Warkentine and the village that allowed for the briefest moments of life. For Cornelius, Mr. Warkentine awakened the memory of his father, who taught him how to fish. Somewhere between heaven and hell, there was the Jewish shtetl of Fedorovka. As in the Jewish shtetls of that time, both Jews and Russians lived together. I will let you decide for yourself to which of the two, heaven or hell, Fedorovka is more akin. I must confess, I often wondered as I pondered the same question, whether God had taken his leave of the place or simply forgot. Whenever I visited Fedorovka, Cornelius said to me one afternoon, it seemed, or maybe it's my imagination, that the sky was always a leaden gray and the wind tore at the trees, flinging branches hither and yon. Garbage was strewn everywhere at the whim of the wind. Fedorovka was always noisy and muddled. Cornelius spoke passionately with gestures befitting an overzealous Italian. Can you imagine, Abraham, the narrow streets wound through the town as if it were a cluttered maze? Broken wagons lay about, horse harnesses here and there. I shook my head in amazed bewilderment, with a hint of wonder, incomprehension, and incredulity. One might wonder if the horses were ever joined to the wagons, said Cornelius. How sad it was to see the blackened frames, which were once houses. In ditches, my goodness, rusted plows turned over. Of what use were they when rusting and overturned? And the weeds, my God, the weeds. Did the people plant weeds for they grew better than everything else? Not a house had a fence that was not broken. The gates hung on threads, garbage piled up against the fences perhaps only functioned to keep out the garbage. And always muddy in the spring, dusty in the summer. It was easy to understand going to Fedorovka why we looked down on the Russians. There was no sense of respect for themselves, living like wild beasts. Perhaps that is what they truly are, wild and untamable. The inscrutable Russian. They are an unfathomable mystery. It is enough to make one give up on life, Abraham. Isaac was not unfamiliar with Stalin's prisons. In 1924, Isaac had been arrested for hiding grain. A neighbor, Mr. Nicholas Sawatsky, had come to him at night and asked for grain. Isaac had none to give. Nonetheless, his neighbors reported him to David Grable. David sent his brigade to Isaac's home. It was late. They stormed into Isaac's home without notice and turned the house inside out. They found no grain. At Isaac's trial, Mr. Sawatsky recanted. He told the court that he had made the whole thing up because he had been angry with Isaac. No matter, Isaac spent 8 years in a Kazakhstan prison. You could sense the breath a mile away in the silence of the mute and the speeches of the blind, in this medley of people bound together by the same grief, terror, and hope, in this hatred and lack of understanding between men who spoke the same tongue. You could see much of the tragedy of the 20th century. In some sick, perverted way, the status of a prisoner in the Gulag was associated with a degree of honor. While it was the end result of a parody on the law, the last thing prison was associated with was justice. Its overtone was a refusal to pay homage to tyranny. These men who dared to stand the ground were in that company of brothers, men such as Osip Mandelstam, Itzhak Babel, although Babel paid the ultimate price for supposedly being a spy and shooting an KVD man. He had never held a gun in his life. The thing about prison, said Isaac, is that it obscures all sense of time. A man can lie in his cell for 25 years and yet think he has been there but a minute, or he can have been there just a day or two, but it seems to him a lifetime. Isaac was sentenced to 8 years, a mere blip in time. Here one meets the devil and Christ in the same sentence, he said to Moshe one night as he sat on the banks of the Tokmak, looking up at a clear night sky, stars, infinite stars. You and I, said Moshe, we sit here together and weep, hoping, longing for Jerusalem. Isaac nodded his head and smiled. There is something in this place, in this time, that settled upon the two, a sense of well-being. In prison, Moshe, you are an animal. Isaac was still. Moshe was silent, waiting for his friend. In prison, I met with your Ruach. We were nothing but zerks. They came, worked us to the bone for hours. Many starved, many died from overwork and no food. Our clothes were rags. Inmates died of disease, always fights over food. Some prisoners hoarded basic items, tobacco, food, sewing needles, and even shoes and sweaters were traded within an intimate and often lethal hierarchy. Protection was bought There was gambling, debts were paid in blood, people murdered over the simplest pretext, over nothing. Food was used as a weapon. It was a way to control the population. The guards controlled every part of our lives, our every existence. If a guard was in a good mood, that would determine how much a prisoner would get to eat. Our work, we dug a canal by hand. Stal wanted his canal. I tell you, Moshi, it was the dead that dug the canal. It was the dead that paid for the canal, and the dead were simply dumped in a ditch, covered with dirt from the diggings that flooded over. It was convenient. They say 12,000 died. I don't know. It's a big number. The guards were inhuman, but more inhuman were those who were really in control, the gangs, criminals, murderers, thieves, rapists. They were truly the ones in control. Even the guards feared them. They controlled every part of our lives. They controlled who did hard labor, who slept where, who got food. It was the gangs that determined the punishment. I tell you, Moshi, I have seen the devil, and he doesn't have a long tail and horns. But his breath, mein Gott. The punishment was swift and unforgiving. Do you think the devil could be so vile? I once broke a code of conduct. To this day, I have no idea what it was that I did. I was beaten, and then Isaac lifted his shirt and revealed a long, deep scar. Moshe looked at the scar, touched it, but said nothing. His eyes, his face grimaced. That said it all. Murder was common, certainly being deprived of food. Peter Jansen, another Mennonite in prison with me, died of starvation. But the best one of all, that's Stalin. He is a shrewd one. Those prisoners picked out for a minefield, if one blew himself up, he had atoned for his crime. If a prisoner refused, the solution was simple. Soldiers were ordered to shoot him on the spot. Just too much for them, for Isaac to remember, and Moshe to hear. Again, they sat in silence. Isaac looked up at the stars. He breathed in deep, and then with a wistful tone, he said, "You know that in prison you never see the stars?" A splash. A fish jumped near the rock on which they were sitting. Across the river, the yellow lights of Fedorovka flickered. They could hear the shouting from drunken men stumbling home from the taverns. Moshe said nothing. He fidgeted uncomfortably as he sat on the rock. "I love sitting here at night with you," said Isaac. "I love to look up at the stars, the heavens. Do you know why?" Moshe shook his head. "When I look up at the night sky, I feel so small, so insignificant, so powerless, but in a good way. I feel as though I am part of something so big, so infinitely big, something that allows me to participate in it. My smallness tells me that all I am required to do is simply live, to recognize that I am alive, that I am blessed. Yes, blessed, even in this hell, but even more. The delusion of dead power is the fleeting contingency on its ability to take life. There is nothing of it that creates, but in my insignificance, I am granted by grace a power far surpassing the dead power of tyranny, for the simple reason that when I gaze into the night sky, I am filled with wonder. I am completely in awe of the fact that as I sit here under the stars looking up, I am overwhelmed with the idea that all this was made with me in it. And it was made out of nothing. God made this for the simple reason that it overwhelmed him with the joy of it. Tyranny can only exist as a pretense of power. It has no imagination, much less an ability to create. The true and real power is the ability to bring into being, to live for the simple reason of the joy of it, for the love of it. The evil of Stalin's prisons is not that they were put there to force us into some macabre, monstrous degeneration, but because their existence is contingent on one principle and one principle only, to beat out of us any vestige of wonder, the joy that comes from love. And I'm going to end with this chapter. It's called The Heart of Darkness. In this chapter, I do some very weird things. I believe the beauty of the novel is that it allows us to experiment and do weird things. And this is, in this chapter, I have the hero, Cornelius, is visited by three characters who had long since had deceased. You'll understand. As the night wrapped its veil around Cornelius, he was visited by Dante. Cornelius spoke to him, and Dante answered, "Remember my words, Cornelius," he whispered, but only loud enough for Cornelius's conscience to hear. I too was in a dark wood. Midway in my life, I was in a dark wood. All sense of right was lost to me. Nothing made sense to me. How could I speak of it? It was too heavy a weight. It wore me down. It tore my spirit. Exhausted, I went astray. I tried to find God, but only found variations of the devil, who taunted me, laughed at me, that I thought even in hell one could find God. Then Dante said to Cornelius, "Without a guide, I would never have found my way. You need a guide, Cornelius." Cornelius had been reading Dostoevsky. Would he be Cornelius's guide? Would he show Cornelius the way through this dark wood? Would he help Cornelius understand and know God? Would he help Cornelius with the most important of all human needs, trust? It was in a dream that he came to Cornelius. "Do you remember reading my novel, The Idiot?" he asked. "Think. When there is torture, there is pain and wounds, physical agony, and all this distracts the mind from mental suffering so that one is tormented only by the wounds until the moment of death. But the most terrible agony may not be in the wounds themselves, but in the knowledge, in knowing for certain that within an hour, then within 10 minutes, then within a half a minute, now at this very moment, this very instant, your soul will leave your body, and you will no longer be. You will no longer be a person, and that is certain. The worst thing is that is certain." "Tell me," Cornelius asked Dostoevsky, "does torture then cause one to willingly stop living?" "Some say that the evil of torture is that you wish for death, that to live is unnatural. It is life out of order. Do you remember when the Grand Inquisitor confronted Christ in my novel, Brothers Karamazov? Do you remember what he said? The great lie is that the secret to human existence does not consist in living, but in what one lives for. Christ offered freedom. The devil offered bread. Freedom was of less value, is of less value than bread. That is what the devil offers. Without a firm idea of what he is to live for, man will not consent to live and will sooner destroy himself than would remain on earth, even though all around him there be loaves. That when it comes down to it, men would rather choose bread over freedom, and even that, in the end, men would choose to throw away freedom. Your troubles. This is the third character, the third visitor. His name is Jean Emery. "You are troubled," said Jean. Cornelius looked up. He saw before him the specter of Jean Emery. He was real enough, though. A conscience come to trouble Cornelius, the last voice to visit him, a voice from the future, one who had lived through it, one who participated in organized resistance against the Nazi occupation of Belgium, which resulted in Jean's detainment and torture by the German Gestapo at Fort Brindok, and several years of imprisonment in concentration camps. He had survived internments in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, only to commit suicide when it was all over. He could tell Cornelius exactly what those bodies in the hut experienced. "In the camps, they prepare you," said Jean. The prisoner gives up and is given up by his comrades. No longer is there room in one's conscience for the contrast of good or bad, noble or base, intellectual or unintellectual. The prisoner, those who come to the hut, he is a staggering corpse, a bundle of physical functions in its last convulsions. And this is the most sinister. Those of us who are spared, we exclude such a one from our consideration. We have no choice, because we know that to consider him is to recognize that we may be the next one. For the intellectual, it is the hardest, Jean continued. For those who think through the phenomena of everyday reality, the reality of the camp is too absurd, too impossible to consider. For the intellectual, the reality of the camp prevents him from adjusting to the surroundings, because these stand in too sharp a contrast to everything that he regards as humanly acceptable or even possible. As a free man, he is only associated with people who are open to humane and reasonable argumentation, and he absolutely does not want to commit to the prisoner. But in regard to the prisoner, the SS employs a logic of destruction that in itself operates just as consistently as the logic of life preservation does in the outside world. You go to your death clean shaven, as if you were going to a job interview or visiting your next door neighbor. The logic of the camp is such that one does not live next door to a fellow prisoner, but to death. Death is omnipresent. The prisoner walks by the corpse hanging on the gallows. It is a natural thing to see them there, as natural as seeing garlic hanging in a kitchen window. The prisoners do not even look up. It is assumed that there will be the dead, and if not, something is amiss. The final duty of the prisoner is death. For the prisoner, death assumes the form of a mathematically determined solution. It is the final solution. The prisoner talks about death as if they were talking about a lover or a dear companion. The prisoners talk about how, never the when, or how long it will take. That is Dr. Clausen's concern. Time, the death of the prisoner in the ice bath. But what Dr. Clausen does in his attempts is to make some religious connection out of it, so death becomes more pleasing, more comforting. He hangs prisoners on a tree as if on a cross, and then pours water on them in the dead of winter to see how long it will take the frozen malefactor to die. Only when death becomes an abstraction can torture make any sense. It is merely a vehicle. Sometimes it works faster than at other times. Success is measured in time. Torture makes something banal of death when torture is treated as though it is an essential part of this life. But there is nothing banal in this evil. It is the most pervasive attack on the human spirit. That is Dr. Clausen's goal, to attack and destroy human dignity, to achieve the impression that human dignity is irrelevant. It is an absurdity, indeed an inconvenience. With that, Dr. Clausen has achieved the ultimate goal of torture, the loss of trust. Trust in the world, trust in what one has always held to as sacred, held as noble, predictable. Torture strips that away, and nothing then can be counted on. With the first blow, everything is shifted out of order. All perception is newly regarded as a lie. Now even the events of the torture are taken as normal, so the prisoner comes to expect torture as a natural phenomenon. Death then is the logical conclusion. It is expected as an absolute. They wait sometimes patiently, expecting the next round to be the one that will bring about their natural conclusion. If death is not forthcoming, there is an impatience for it. Are we not fully human that we should not die? Asks the prisoner. In the end, it is not the individual that is nullified, but humankind. To continue to live is tantamount to declaring that the prisoner is not fully human. The prisoner has not reached their goal, their full capacity, and the torturer, he performs his duty in the most blasé manner possible, for he has not confronted a human, but an object. What does he have to invest in an object? Nothing. He can sit and smoke a cigarette, read a magazine to the sound of torture. Cornelius sat in stunned silence. There was nothing to say to Jean. You're troubled? Said Jean. Yes. Jean was quiet for a moment and then said, that is a good thing. Good. It is good, yes. It is good because now you know. Why did you have to tell me? Again, John was quiet. He gave his next answer a good deal of thought. I tell you this because, as I just said, now you know. Now you have an obligation. Now you must tell what you know. You have knowledge. Now your words can serve as a warning to those who might so easily fall a victim to the illusion that comes with a submission without fully comprehending what it is one submits to the illusion of a false reality. And in conclusion, I want to leave with you two quotes, one by Jean-Paul Sartre. Every word has consequences, every silence too. And this last one by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran pastor who was executed in Auschwitz because he resisted evil. He was actually involved in an attempt to assassinate Hitler, and he never forgave him. I mean, he never argued that that was a good thing, that he'd have to live with that. But this is what he says: silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Okay, that's it.
Wow. Okay, everybody, you can unmute yourselves now, because I'd love for us to have a discussion with Richard about what he shared with us. I love the reading, Richard, and I know that's a really benign word, if you like, for what I just heard. What I loved about it, Richard, was your passion, and that I felt how real this touched you, and it touched me as well. It's a long time ago, I read someone who said, we have to read the things we don't want to hear about. And I think that's the hardest thing, is opening ourselves up to hearing this stuff. I thank you so much. So I'm hoping there are some questions for Richard. Okay, I'll ask a quick question while other people are thinking about their questions. What was the hardest part of this book for you to write?
I think the heart of, as I said, I'm a Mennonite. And I was raised in a home, in a community where we believed that the words of the Gospels actually were supposed to be taken seriously. To do good, to love your enemy, to do good to those who hate you, to turn the other cheek, and then realizing that within the framework of my own history, the larger context, this existed. And I found it really, really hard, and I still do. I found it really, really difficult and painful to come to terms with that and to reconcile that. How, and yet, as my good friend Robert Martins, who is there, I remember saying, I remember actually I was working on a different novel, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And then my neighbor came up and showed me some material about a conference that was taking place in the States I'm not sure exactly where it is. I know Robert will know. Newton, Kansas. I'm not sure. In which the Mennonite historian um, uh, Ben Goosen wrote a book published by Princeton University Press about the Mennonites' role, or the Mennonites' role in towards. I don't know how to. I'm not sure how to articulate this well enough. So basically, he's revealing the story, the history of the Mennonites and their collusion in a way, but in Germany. So Ben Goosen focuses on Germany, and Ben Goosen basically elaborated some pretty gruesome facts, and I was beyond anger when I read about this. I said, how is it possible that we, people who believed in and who loved justice and non-resistance, how could we do this? Robert then said something really, really important, and he said, "What would you have done?" I said, and I sort of, what do you mean, what would I have done? He said, "Stop for a moment and think. What would you have done? The Mennonites had, since 1917 and beyond, been subject to absolute horrific treatment by, and I mean, Stalin was out to destroy the Mennonites. And from the Mennonite perspective, they, if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but they came to believe, and I think accurately so, that many of the people who were persecuting the Mennonites, the revolutionaries, had Jewish roots. So, I mean, imagine seeing, like you're a child and you see your mother, father, and children just brutally murdered. Mothers raped, fathers killed just because they're Mennonites. And I said, what would you have done? Then suddenly here comes the German army, and and they're here to liberate you. And I raise a question in the novel. It says, how can the monster be a liberator? How is it possible that the monster can be the liberator? So I had to come to terms with that question. And so I said, well, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to answer that question? I said, well, what I'll do is I think I'll write a novel. So, which is what I did. And so writing the novel, in the process, there's a part of me that extends the hand of says, forgiveness, but at the same time, is well mediated by the sense that this horror is unforgivable. Those two, that tension between these two realities, that something is, we are called to forgive, and yet how can we forgive something that's unforgivable? So I try, and trying to come to those, wrestling with that was for me the big issue.
Yeah. R, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, not a question, but I just wanted to make a statement. I was born in Canada, and my parents, they came from Poland. They met in Canada after the war, got married, had kids. And I did travel through Eastern Europe during the Cold War, during the communist time. It was the hardest trip I ever made in my life. I recall crossing the border from Yugoslavia to Hungary, and it was just like these spy stories with Checkpoint Charlie, and this was at nighttime, with these big towers with machine guns and barbed wire and searchlights and dogs and soldiers. And I was going to visit a family I'd never met ever before in Poland. And on the way, I remember stopping in and visiting the worst death camp in the world, Auschwitz.
Mm.
And I'll never forget standing in a room in the gas chamber where 1 million people died, right here where I am. And the next concentration camp down the road is Birkenau. It's just unbelievably huge. And I saw that. And
Yeah.
in the last few months, I've discovered audiobooks, and I've been listening to many about Eastern Europe, and I wanted to better understand what my parents went through. They're not Jewish, and it is just horrific.
Mhm.
And Stalin, I'm sure, is the worst mass murderer in the history of the earth.
Mm.
And it is just never-ending genocide, crimes against humanity, what he did and what Hitler did. And you had these two fascist dictators. And so I'm listening to Richard talk about him expressing these emotions, and I had an opportunity to see these things, or see the remains of these things. It's all true. It's all true. It's all real. And I tell you, if I had been born at that time as a young man, I would have been a freedom fighter, joining the guerrilla unit and fighting back. And I remember visiting Warsaw, capital of Poland, and on just about every street corner, there's a plaque where dozens of people were machine gunned, and Warsaw was 80% destroyed and flattened by these criminals out of the SS.
Yeah, it's a horrible history, really.
Oh,
It
it's
really
really
is a
horrible. And what Richard's talking about, I
Yeah.
understand what he's saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I've been to Auschwitz. I didn't want to go, but we were in that area, and my daughter and granddaughter convinced me to go. It was the best and the worst thing I've ever done. It's traumatizing. It's almost unbelievable, the depth and the breadth of the inhumanity that those people were put to. And anybody who says it didn't happen is absolutely talking out of a hole in their head. Richard, okay, now, does anybody else want to say anything, to ask a question? I mean, I'm still dealing with all the information Richard has given us.
Excellent reading,
Yes.
fascinating detail. You did a brilliant job of bringing that to us tonight.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Yeah. Yeah. It was brilliant. I wanted to throw this out there because it seems to me that we're living in precarious times right now. And nobody really knows what's going to happen. And because we know this history of the loss of somehow the downgrading of democracy and the research or surge in oh gosh, it's more than I don't want to say conservatism, because that's not what it is. It's the oh gosh, well, Richard, you know the word to describe people who overrun other people and try to control them and want to destroy them. So Richard, have you thought about what's happening in the world today? I mean, I'm not suggesting that you're kind of out there, but this feels to me as if we need to know this history because we're so verging on the edge of it.
Well, yeah, I do think about it. There isn't a day that I don't think about it. I think that we're I think we're heading into a very dark future.
Yes.
Um, you know, I could go on and on and on, and I have with other friends about the politics that I see around me, and I mean, the sense, the lot for me, it's the loss of any conception of what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that is opening the door to some very, very dark consequences.
Yes. Yes.
That's how, I mean, and I don't want to be like, I know my daughters and my wife and my daughters keep saying I'm such a dark person.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm dark. I'm dark. And yet I have friends. I think if Ernie's still there, he makes me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I have moments in which um, I do laugh. I mean, that's really important. But you know, and I guess I laugh at sometimes at the absurdity of the social behavior. I try to laugh at myself a lot, um, because I am somewhat of a fool sometimes.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, and laughter is not about sort of a dismissal of what's
No.
going on. I think laughter is an important antidote.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I,
agree. Yeah. I mean, God made us with the ability to laugh and see the humor in the world.
well, again, that section that I read about the darkness of the prison system
Mm-hmm.
was that it it denied us. It denies human beings, people in that kind of a setting. It denies and denied them the ability to love. It denied. I mean, how like uh, it it robs people of an ability to see meaning in life. Viktor Frankl said the only way that his only thing that kept him, that kept him alive in Auschwitz was that he had to find meaning in something every day, to find meaning in something.
Yeah.
And that's true. But I then say, yes, that is true. But what is it? Then my next question is, but what is it that we choose to find meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
That's, for me, that becomes part of a scary topic for discussion, because what I see is the things that people find meaningful today are empty of soul.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'm sorry to be so dark.
No, honestly, you're not being dark. You're being, to me, you're being honest and direct. And we need more of that honest and directness. We need to be able to see the dark side. Otherwise, we can't find the light. There's no way. Yeah. So anybody else? KB.
Yeah. I debated whether or not to discuss this. Every time it comes up, I debate whether to discuss it because it can be taken in the wrong way. So please don't misconstrue what I'm trying to say here. Richard, I think one of the most important and profound sentences you said, the 5 little words, what would you have done?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a huge can of worms.
Mm-hmm.
And from time to time, there's some scandal, usually in the educational system, when somebody raises the topic of what were the benefits of something horrible, whether it be, residential schools or slavery or stuff. And there's this big foo-for-all, like, how could you possibly think of that? And yet, if we ignore the fact that evils are frequently couched in benefit, we're not on the lookout for that.
Mm-hmm. That's the seductiveness of it, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Perfect
It
word.
makes it acceptable. In fact, it
Mhm.
makes it not just acceptable, but it makes it inviting.
Attractive.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very real danger that we try to pretend that that's not there, that we have to
Well,
look past.
I'm going to paraphrase C.S. Lewis really badly in his book, Screw Tape Letters. Senior Devil says to the junior devil, you know, the best way to win them over is to try to make the road really comfortable, straight. Take out the sharp curves in the road, make it nice and straight and smooth and comfortable.
Mhm.
That way, because if there are sharp bends in the curve, you got to stop and negotiate. But Senior Devil says, make it possible that they don't have to negotiate. Meaning they don't have, and I don't mean negotiate, with the devil, but negotiate. Well, okay. The question, all right, I'm faced with this. What am I going to do?
Mhm.
What is the moral thing to do? What is the just thing to do? What is the right thing to do? But remove all those little barriers along the way that would cause you to ask these pertinent kinds of questions that make you say, what kind of a world do we want to live in?
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, that's and my apologies to my C.S. Lewis friends for that horrible. Yeah.
You don't need to apologize for anything.
Okay. Thank you.
Nothing, not a thing.
All right.
Anybody else? Or shall we relieve Richard of his duties? Jarina, is your hand up or is that waving by? It's waving bye-bye? No, you want to say something or it's just
Oh.
clapping? That's what it is. Okay. Yes, I think we should all unmute ourselves and give Richard a big hand so he can hear us.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. I really appreciate this. This meant a lot to me.
Very powerful.
Thank you for giving us your time.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Your wisdom.
Well, whatever, for what it's worth.
And your deep feeling. Sorry.
May I ask, what's the best way to purchase your book, Richard? Can we direct the people in the right direction?
I'm sorry. I cut you off. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Start again. I cut you off.
I'm wondering if anyone would like to purchase your book, should they go to Amazon or what do you recommend?
Okay.
To buy your book.
Hang on. Something's happening.
Where
here.
should we go?
Okay. I'm out of copies. Like I'm going to order some tomorrow. And then if you're interested in buying it from me directly, we can work something out, or you can purchase it through Amazon. Since all of you are Canadians, I gather, you can order it through Amazon.ca. The Confession by there's Confession by Richard Taves.
Yeah.
So if you want a copy from me, again, it'll take. I don't know how long this is going to take now. I'm down to one. I'm sold out of the copies that I have at home, and which happened just today. Apologies. So it probably would take 3 or 4 weeks for me. Okay. Given the situation now with the mail, I don't know if that's, because it's actually, well, I don't see why it would be a problem in Canada. Yeah, but so I would have to order it, but I would have to order it from the States.
Yeah. So that would be my preference because you would sign them, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I would sign them.
Yeah. So what if we let Janet know, those of us who are interested? And Janet, can you let Richard know, or would you like people to let me know so I can let Richard know?
And
Whatever you like, or they could
what I could
email
do
Richard.
is, okay, 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 the books, Amazon, through Amazon.ca, the books are $29.95, but I'm willing to sell them for $20.
Okay,
Mhm.
so,
And
so Richard.
however, if I have to ship, if I have to mail them, I'd have to tack on postage. But what I could do is, if you're interested, I don't know where people are,
Mhm.
but I could drop them off in New West.
Yeah.
But those who don't
You
live,
hold
who
up
live
a
outside
copy?
the Lower Main, I'm sorry, what?
Could you hold up a copy?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Ah, okay,
yeah.
got you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There.
Nice, nice,
Okay.
okay.
So, Richard,
Yes,
can I put your email into the chat box? Or you can
Yes.
type it in, okay?
yes, you can do
Okay.
that.
And then we can get in touch with you individually. That's great.
Sure, you can do
Okay.
that. Yes.
So Janet, you'll post that, right? Good, okay.